Everybody, Alan Robson with you for yet another of Alan Robson's Grisly Tales. This is solid grizzle from start to finish, so buckle up. As Betty Davis once said, it is going to be a bumpy ride. We're starting off with something that you've probably done a bit more of in recent weeks, months and years, and that is watching movies. So what's grisly about that? Well, as a bit of an expert about torture and the history of torture, I thought we would take a look at how movies have imitated the horrific art of hurting people. If you go back throughout history, people have always wanted, even enjoyed, inflicting pain on other people. It's horrific, it's sick, and it's wrong, but it happened. So how have movies taken things and depicted them on a screen so that it can stimulate your adrenaline and give you a bit of a rush? It is like having a run of a car down a motorway and you see an accident on the other side of the road. Everybody slows down to have a look. You shouldn't, but you can't look away. Something disgusting means you jerk your head away. You might hide your head in your hands, but you're peering curiously through the gaps in your fingers. That adrenaline, that rush, the same thing as you get on a roller coaster, happens when you see horrific things occur on your television screens or at the cinema if ever we're allowed back. Now, there was a Yakuza movie, you know, the Japanese mafia. The film was called Ichi the Killer. And during that, a gang boss goes missing, so one of their enforcers comes up with a whole range of tortures that he was supposed to have invented to interrogate his enemies and find out where his boss was. Well, on one of the scenes, one of the mafia wakes up to find himself hanging from meat hooks that run the length of his back and limbs. He even impales the man's mouth through the cheeks with steel tempura skewers and then starts interrogating him. And then he takes a pot of boiling oil off the cooker top and he pours it all over the man. And you think, well, that's horrific. Didn't he invent some incredible tortures? Well, the impaling, of course, came from Vlad Dracul. And in robsonsworld.com we visit the castle of Vlad Dracul the Impaler, and we hear all of the stories of how he used to enjoy hanging people on hooks just because he liked to see blood dripping. The tempura skewers through the mouth, something that Vlad used to do. In fact, on a couple of occasions he skewered the mouths shut of Turkish officials because he was having a bit of a battle with the Ottoman Empire. The boiling oil off the stove, that is a torture that's been documented since Greek and Roman times. So not exactly brand new, you would have to say. There's a lot of other films, and many of them I'm fairly sure that you will have seen in your time because they're quite disgusting. One of the obvious movie contenders is another movie that's inspired me to travel across the world to Slovakia. The original building used in the film Hostel was in Slovakia, and I decided to go across and check out the building. We were shot at, we were chased, but we did manage to get a program like no other. And if you want to hear the whole 3-4 hours of it, you can do that again on robsonsworld.com. Now, in Slovakia, the building that was used for the film Hostel, the first movie, was actually used to house the dead bodies of people ethnically cleansed during that whole mess over there. The entire building, floor to ceiling, on every floor, had piles of human bodies, men, women, and children. Now, if you've seen the film Taken, with Liam Neeson, you will know, well, you've got to be a little bit careful when you're travelling across, especially Eastern Europe. But with Hostel, there was an absolutely disgusting way of ripping out somebody's eye. You will remember a guy escaping from a torture dungeon, and he turns back to save a girl when he hears screaming, and he walks in and there was a girl having her eye removed. Now, he killed the torturer, good on him, and he has to try and save the girl by removing her semi-detached eyeball that's hanging down her cheek. Horrible scene. It will make you want to throw, but you'll still watch. Now, the ripping out of eyeballs and having them hanging down your cheek has been a well-documented torture from medieval times. The blindings throughout the 12 to 1500s. It was a way of forcing people to pay their taxes. And it's the more painful when you don't use a sharp implement to do it. People used to do it with spoons so that the eye didn't rip out and it just hung there. And there's no easy way of getting that sucker back in. Another incredible movie was, of course, Reservoir Dogs. And you might remember a horrible moment in that when Mr. Blonde cuts off a family's ears while in quarantine. I mean, whenever you hear that Steelers Wheel Jerry Rafferty song, Stuck in the Middle with You, you imagine him torturing the kidnapped policeman. The difference between torture back in the day and what happened in Reservoir Dogs, Mr. Blonde tells his victim that he's not just going to rip into him to get some information. He says he's going to do it because he thinks it's fun. And that meant a policeman's ear being cut off with a cutthroat razor. And all the while, Mr. Blonde is dancing about to some cool tunes of the day. The removal of ears, again, a common punishment. And if a gangster during the time of Al Capone didn't listen to what his boss said, an ear would be removed. If somebody spoke out and said something to someone that they shouldn't, then a tongue would be removed. Gangster times to modern day gangsters in films seems a fairly logical progression. Now, one film that I really hated because at the time it led to a whole host of copycats was Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange. Malcolm McDowell making that role his own, and it was essentially about gangs that went around bullying, torturing, killing, raping sick individuals on the street. And I lived in the West End in Newcastle where there were people like that. During the time of Clockwork Orange, I remember being a little kid getting stopped by a gang of lads, and they all had small hatchets with them. They didn't hit me with them, but mate, they scared the shit out of me. The scene from the film that was so brutal you would probably jerk your head away was when the anti-hero, the delinquent Alex, played by Malcolm McDowell, was strapped to a chair and they were forcing his eyes open to watch all of the violence, the kind of violence that he was famous for. And the idea was to try and make him sickened by the crime, but he was just enjoying it. To see other people being tortured was not a new invention. Again, it's been done since the dawn of time, but particularly well at Chillingham Castle, the home of the torturers. There, on purpose, they made people hear others being tortured so that they would give up any information that they had. They also made people watch other people be tortured, thinking this is going to happen to me unless I say something. They nearly always spoke out and told everything they knew, and were tortured anyway. We've visited Gillingham on many occasions and we've took hundreds of people up over the years. If you want to hear how they got on, robsonsworld.com again will do it for you. But we're looking at torture from the movies. I remember discussing the Saw movies with Tobin Bell on a radio program once, and he used to say how members of the crew used to laugh at the horrific sequences that they put together for that film. It is one of those movies that does make your flesh crawl. But there was a flashback by one woman who was helping the police, and she remembered meeting the serial killer, Tobin Bell's character, Jigsaw. And this made her having to get a key from out of her cellmate's stomach to unlock a huge metal device that was attached to her head that was rigged to rip her jaw open when the timer expires. And that torture, you would think, oh, how novel that was. Well, there were also in French castles strange metal attachments that they used to put on to people's chins, and they would add weights to them. They would start with fairly light weights until the person could no longer close their jaw. Their mouth was wide open. Sometimes they would drown them by pouring water into their mouth, and they couldn't close their mouth, so they ended up swallowing and drowning. On other occasions, they put so much weight on the chin that it literally ripped the whole bottom of your head off. Once again, history always got there first. Now, I must admit, I'm a bit of a fan of Martin Scorsese, and in one of his films, Casino, didn't think it was a particularly good film, but Joe Pesci is in there as like a gangster, Nicky Santoro, and he wasn't able to get information out of a rival after 2 days and nights of punching, kicking, slicing, stabbing. So this was the time that he ended up putting the man's head in a woodworking vise and squeezing the head until it exploded like a melon. And you think, well, obviously, that has to be a fairly modern idea. No. You go back to the 900s, and people used exactly the same technology to either crush people, to break their feet, to flatten all of the bones in their hands, and if they really wanted to make an example out of somebody or to intimidate other prisoners, they would put their head in one of these devices and then turn the screw until the head literally bursts wide open. Now, after Sergio Leone did all of those spaghetti westerns, he put together a movie called Once Upon a Time in America. It was an amazing film. Some parts of it I hated because it was so true to life, and a lot of it harrowing. Now, there was one sequence in there where there's a guy with his hands tied behind his back and a choke rope securing his neck to a speed bag. During the interrogation, he's punched and punched and punched, and the ropes at the same time are strangling him. His face blows up like a balloon, his eyes are black, and essentially his whole head is being starved of blood. Now, that whole idea and that particular way of fastening ropes around your neck go back to Sumerian times, where it was used as a punishment for those that disagreed with the leaders of the day. They were not even particularly tortured. They were left to die, and the more that you try and pull your hands from the back, the more you are choking yourself at the front. So, let's get into Christianity just for a tad. Mel Gibson got into all kinds of trouble when he made that film, The Passion of the Christ. It was supposed to be a historical movie when, in fact, there is no recorded history at all of anybody called Jesus Christ. There is no history whatsoever. The only history was written 270 years after they claim that Jesus Christ died. So it's a fairy story at very best, because how much history could you write of anything that happened 270 years ago? Anyway, the crucifixion showed a degree of barbarity, and it was standard treatment by the Romans on people that they disagreed with. The only thing that Mel did, he completely went over the top, showing every single detail about how the weight of a body that's nailed to a piece of wood, how the nails would tear into the skin, rip the hands, rip the feet, how a sword or a spear wound to the side, if you open the body, would have in fact probably have caused all of the internal organs to slop out through the hole, and that never happened. And how horrific and painful it would be when the wooden cross was raised. But you have to remember there were no such thing as crosses. The crucifix is something created by Christians as a symbol, because the Romans used T-shaped pieces of wood to crucify people. There are literally hundreds of stories and tales on robsonsworld.com where we enlighten people about exactly what happened. There's a film called Martyrs that you may or may not have seen. Quite a good film, brutal as hell, where a woman executes a family who were violent towards her as a child. She's haunted by all of the memories. She hurts herself, self-mutilates, which is a horrible thing. I hope you don't know anyone who does that. It's an awful, awful thing. And she believed she was being savaged by a ghost, a poltergeist, a demon of some kind. So they start to investigate, and her friend is kidnapped by a cult that tortures people to try and make them see the truth of spirit, to give them enlightenment, to make them modern-day martyrs. So after undergoing a whole range of tortures, the girl, Anna, played by Moyana Alui, is skinned alive. Now, you don't actually see the skinning, but the film does show what's left of Anna on the table, totally skinned, still wide awake, when one of her torturers is trying to find out whether just before she dies, whether she's actually reached enlightenment through all of the agonies that she suffered. It's horrific. And yet, on Robson's World, we tell the story of the Seg Hill salt skin, because quite often Vikings would completely skin any priest, not because they hated Christianity. They saw priests and they were always rich, and they always had a whole pile of slaves doing all of their work for them, and they would take money from the locals, say it was for God, and use it on themselves. The Vikings hated this, so they would skin any priests that they came across. In the case of the Seg Hill salt skin, that whole story's waiting for you on robsonsworld.com, and it's one of the greatest and most amazing stories, especially if you live anywhere near the Seg Hill area, because it was right on your doorstep. So what did people back in the day do with those who had been skinned? Well, the Vikings would leave them to die, and usually wild dogs, wild animals of the field, blue balls and flies would lay their eggs, and they'd be eaten away by maggots. And occasionally, if they hated the person they'd done it to, and let's face it, you don't do that to anybody that you actually like, they have even been known to hurl them into salt pits to give them the extreme agony of death. Over the years, I think we've all been a bit of a fan of the odd World War II movie, and there was a horrible film made based loosely on the Marquis de Sade, so they're already admitting to the history that they take it from. They called it The 120 Days of Sodom, and they based it in Italy, in a republic called Salo. And it's 4 strong men, a duke, a bishop, a magistrate, and the president, lock themselves in a castle and torture people that they've ordered their soldiers to go and kidnap. People who are responsible for fascism, capitalism, power, authoritarianism, and even the scenes that you would consider tame are shown in a horrific, horrible and brutal fashion. But it's towards the end where the violence starts to spiral. People being scalped, lynched, set on fire, red-hot irons pushed through their chests. And yet, in the end, they show a couple of soldiers just dancing with each other, having a bit of fun, while everybody else was inside being tortured terribly. So let's have a look at it. The red-hot irons. From about the year 600, we've got stories of people being burnt with red-hot irons, usually as a punishment, sometimes even to spell out words on their flesh. People being burned alive. Well, ask witches, warlocks, and more often, ordinary people who just didn't want to believe in the religion they were being forced to believe in. Lynchings. Throughout America, lynchings became commonplace, but all over Britain they were used too, particularly in the story of Sawney Bean, the Scottish cannibal, still considered Britain's greatest ever serial killer. That story and that time we visited the cave of Sawney Bean is another on robsonsworld.com. We've been busy. And finally, scalping. Now, instantly you will probably think, oh, scalping, Native Americans did that. Well, they did, but they were only doing that because that's what the white man had been doing to them. As proof that they'd killed a Native American, they had to take their scalps back to claim a bounty. Oh, we were a sophisticated lot back then, weren't we? Once again, movies directly taking from history. A grisly history, but history nonetheless. I have to say, this is an old film, but a goodie. And James Caan played a writer, and he was trying to find a nice place where he could write a book. And his car spins off the road, and he wakes up being nursed back to health by a lady called Annie, played amazingly by Kathy Bates. Now, the film Misery is exactly that, because the writer soon realizes that the woman looking after him is psychotic, and he tries to escape, and she won't have that. When she catches him, she places a wood block between his feet and then smashes both of his ankles with a sledgehammer. This is a procedure known to this day as hobbling, and they used to do it with runaway slaves on all of the Caribbean islands, once again carried out by white people in a way of trying to stop innocent folk getting away from the place where they were being tortured. Hobbling was also carried out across China, and a great many enemies to the great dynasty leaders would find themselves having their ankles smashed too. This next one's a bit controversial, and you would think, well, this has to be even the phrase we've only got to know in recent years, waterboarding. No, it's not something you do at the coast when the waves are up. This is something very nasty indeed. There was a film called Zero Dark 30, a good movie, tells the story of the capture and ultimate death of Osama bin Laden after he orchestrated the attacks on 9/11. And there's a scene where a terrorist is waterboarded to try and get information for the CIA. The Americans then, of course, claimed that they would never use that. Instead, they used enhanced interrogation techniques, which meant waterboarding and a whole host of other things. Is it new? Out of all of the tortures, drownings were common. That's a way that many people who they claimed to be a witch would ultimately die. But the idea of lying somebody down with a cloth over their face is one of the only relatively new tortures to come out in any film, and it is very much a modern creation. Not much to be proud of, I don't think you would say, but brand new. Now, I've saved what I consider to be the worst and most horrible torture for last. And it's a film that starred Dustin Hoffman. Not just Dustin Hoffman, Roy Scheider was in it. Somehow, poor Dustin gets entangled in an international jewel thievery conspiracy, and he ends up in a dentist's chair. And let's face it, most of us would rather not have to go through the whole dental thing. But Sir Laurence Olivier plays an ex-Nazi war criminal called Zell, and he interrogates Dustin Hoffman as he's tied to the dentist's chair using dentist's drills. But instead of trying to save this fella from any pain, he was trying to inflict the worst pain they possibly could. Now, you may think this has to be a modern torture, yet it was used in Wild Western America as a way to get information from people. They would use the kind of dentist's drill you had to pump with your foot, which I think would make it possibly even more painful. The ripping out of teeth, that's been carried out since the dawn of time. But an interesting look I think you'll find on how old tortures and tortures we've come across on many occasions. There is a grisly trail of Prague that we go on, where I go around a torture museum explaining how everything works, if torture is something that you are particularly interested in. But let's have another grisly tale, and this time of a ghostly ilk. Now, we've talked a little bit about hanging, lynching, and whenever I hear of yet another pub that claims to be infested with ghosts, I'm always sceptical. Yet the Crown Inn in Bilderston in Suffolk does seem to have a bit of an interesting track record. To be honest, at first I wasn't even going to tell you about this place, but I ended up getting a story from a lady called Jacqueline Marr who lives in Romford, and it told of a member of her family who suffered a tragic death at the inn on Biddleston's High Street. It's still there, but her family suffered there in the 1800s. Now, in her letter there was no mention of the Crown Inn. This building was the only one to fit the bill, and it's certainly old enough. So let's away to rural Suffolk in the days of the old man at his plough, women planting in the fields, and the old squire living a life of leisure up in his mansion. There seemed to be no escape in those days. If you were born poor, more than likely you would die much the same way. Yet Helen Marr had higher ideals. She'd been raised on the writings of such as Walter Scott. She dreamed of being waded on hand and foot, of being swept off her feet by her very own Sir Lancelot, who would carry her off to his castle and protect her for evermore. Now, she was wise enough to realise that it was most unlikely, but she could dream, and dream she did. Miraculously, she met a young man in Bilderston on market day. They struck up a close friendship. To her shock and utmost delight, after she'd met the guy about 6 or 7 times, she discovered he was the local squire's son, and as that, heir to his fortune. He had returned some months earlier from Spain, where he'd fought alongside Sir John Moore to repulse Soult's French battalions. The young man's name was Frederick Morton. He'd been wounded by grape shot, and he'd been returned to England to recuperate. Now, the two didn't know how long they would be together, so they made sure that they would squeeze the most out of every single second. They would ride together around the Morton estate, they would picnic, travel to London, journey along the coast, always clinging to one another. They were the very picture of love in bloom. And as always, it's then that Frederick received his orders to return to his unit. This hit them both like a hammer, their immediate plans crumbling away. As they proceeded to prepare for the parting, Frederick spoke to Helen of love, of marriage, and of how he wanted to have children with her, and how he would write every day, and on his return they would never be parted again. Squire Morton, Frederick's father, was less keen on this union, as Helen was from a poor family with nothing to offer the rich Morton bloodline. He saw the girl as merely a mercenary money grabber, interested only in his son's wealth and position. And yet nothing could have been further from the truth. Helen really loved young Frederick, and it wouldn't have mattered if he was penniless. Such was her pure and undying love. After a tearful farewell, Helen was driven in a coach back to her father's tied cottage, close to the edge of the Morton estate. The entire journey was an ear-bashing from the squire as how these childish infatuations had to be put into perspective. How Frederick was already promised to the daughter of a wealthy family in a neighbouring borough. Helen could see right then that she was being frozen out, and could only hope and pray that her Frederick had meant all of the things that he'd said to her. A few months later, the United States declared war on Great Britain, and Frederick Morton was one of the men ordered to journey to the New World with his regiment. The year was 1812, and no one could believe that Britain, one of the world's great colonial powers, could possibly be defeated by a rabble of a nation such as America then was. Helen had hoped to see Frederick before he left, as she had some important news. However, Squire Morton had met Frederick in London and had escorted him to Southampton, where the regiment joined its ship for the horrendous journey across the Atlantic towards Baltimore. On the Squire's return, he was surprised to see the Mar girl waiting for him in his study. Her important news could wait no longer. She was pregnant. She removed her cape to show that she was at least 8 months, and the squire's grandson was to be born, as he said, a bastard. Old man Morton tried to take this in his stride and offered her a bribe. When this didn't work, he tried to avoid any scandal by sending her to a private hospital in the country to have the baby. Helen did visit the hospital, but she returned after a week when the staff told her that the baby was to be adopted. But this was Frederick's baby. She wanted to keep the child. Finally, the squire threatened to run her family out of the shire if she refused to cooperate. And over the next few weeks, he tried every conceivable tactic to intimidate. Helen's old dog, a friendly golden Labrador called Ben, had its throat cut and was disemboweled. Its intestines trailed the full length of the fence around the Mars garden. In the early hours, the family discovered the house was on fire. They managed to save most of the building, but the roof needed to be entirely rethatched. Helen's father was beaten unconscious by some of Morton's farm labourers. Every day there was an incident, until finally the squire decided that Helen would only relent if she herself was threatened. So reluctantly, he ordered 2 of his most loutish workers to catch her when she was alone and force her out of the county. They followed her for almost 2 days, and one evening she was heading home through Bilderston as darkness crept across the august landscape, and they snatched her. One with his hand over her mouth, the other clenching her legs tightly. They carried her into the stables of an inn around the back of the high street. They locked the door and lit a lamp. There, On the straw lay the heavily pregnant girl, terrified that her struggling may have harmed her unborn child. The men spat threats at her, and she spat curses back at them. Helen was a most attractive girl, and this gave the thugs another idea. One of them held her hands, and the other began to unbutton her long dress. She tried to scream, only to have a gag tied across her face. "You caught the squire's son by opening your legs, so now you'll have to open your legs to us too." She panicked and struggled, fighting as best she could. All the while the verbal assault continued. "We'll say the baby could be ours, you slut. Then where will you be?" Finally, when the dress, already stretched as far as it could be, was opened, the huge stomach could be seen. Surely the baby was due in a matter of days, a matter of hours. Even these disgusting louts couldn't have sex with a woman in that condition. They were running out of ideas, so they tied her hands behind her back and placed a noose around her neck, hurling the other end of the rope over one of the roof joists of the barn. "All right, bitch," barked one of the toughs. "Unless you swear to leave the county, you're gonna swing this night." Still Helen refused to leave, saying, "When Frederick returns, you'll both pay for this with your lives." At that, one of the men lifted the pregnant woman off the ground, returning her to her feet with a bump. "That's a warning, lady. We don't want to hurt you, but hurt you we will. Just get yourself gone, and you'll not be hurt." Still, she shook her head. The thugs were in a total loss as to what to do next. So finally, they both pulled on the rope, lifting Helen right up into the air, so high she was almost up to the roof. They were just about to bring her back down, suitably scared, when the weight of the baby and the shock of the noose began the birth process. Both of the louts were unaware of this until, to their horror, the baby plummeted to the stable floor with a sickening splat. The men let go of the rope, and Helen's choking body fell 15 to 20 feet on top of the baby. Her hands were still tied, and she rolled helplessly around the blood-sodden stable floor. Behind the gag, she was screaming over and over again. The men knew that they would pay with their lives if they were discovered party to this. So they grabbed the rope and pulled her back up by her throat. She kicked, she wriggled, she writhed for almost 30 minutes until finally the life left her. All the while, she gazed down at the child created by their special love. The special child who had been killed in such a senseless manner. Before the men left, they cut the ropes that they had tied her hands with, removed the gag, and just left the body hanging, as if she'd committed suicide. The squire was appalled to hear that she had taken her own life, but deep down, he was glad that both she and the baby were no longer a problem. Now her first grandson would come from the upper class, thus guaranteeing the blue blood of the Morton family line. His happiness was soon brought to an end by a letter from the government saying that Frederick Morton had been killed within days of his arrival in America in a battle to capture Fort Detroit. The squire was the last male in his family line. Ironically, he had been the man behind the death of the only child with any claim to his estate. Now, whether the stable concerned was that of the Crown Inn of Bilderston, nobody can really be sure. But it's interesting to know that they do have a ghost, supposedly of a woman that they had found hanging in the stable. If you visit the Crown Inn, they have as many as 4 different phenomena. The ghastly experience of the stable, a most eerie place to visit at night or by candlelight. They also have the spirits of 2 young children from the late 1800s. Customers regularly spot them. And there's also a ghostly old man in the bar, and a swishing sound. Perhaps the crinoline of Helen Mar trying to escape from her torturers. Now we all have, or we should have, a loathing for those who find themselves on the sex offenders register. Now I have to say, I can't really include 16-year-old boys who dated a 15-year-old girl. I'm not talking about that kind of thing. Sex offenders, rapists, hate them, loathe them. They should be destroyed. They should not be living, these creatures. But let me tell you about a few famous ones, shall I? The Pope. Well, obviously not the current fella, not that we know of. Pope Sixtus III. He was taken to court for raping a nun. Now, the nun was there. She was pregnant. Her eyes were blackened. Her belly just starting to grow. Her legs were all badly bruised. It was obvious that she had been raped. The only man who had visited her alone was the Pope, but as there were no eyewitnesses to the rape, he got away with it. It was a man's world back then. Still is, pretty much. Sick society. Okay, another sex offender that you would never have thought of. The guy who wrote The Pilgrim's Progress, Geoffrey Chaucer, English poet. He was accused of rape by Cecile Champagne, a baker's daughter. Chaucer admitted that he'd raped her, but he paid her off so that the charges were dropped against him. Doesn't change the fact he was a scumbag rapist. Okay, somebody famous. Ernest, the Duke of Cumberland, the younger brother to King George IV. He denied raping and making pregnant one of his own sisters. Okay, Lord Palmerston, the British Prime Minister, attempted to rape one of Queen Victoria's ladies-in-waiting while he was a house guest of the Queen's at Windsor. Poshies always think they can get away with anything, and in this case, he did. Another famous actor of his day, more from the silent movies, so probably have to ask your great-great-great-grandfather, Fatty Arbuckle was an American actor. His career ended in 1921 when he was tried for the rape and manslaughter of a young starlet in a San Francisco hotel room. His weight, as he was after all Fatty Arbuckle, suffocated her to death. He was tried and acquitted of rape and manslaughter. However, neighbouring people in rooms heard the girl screaming as if he was attacking her. No has to mean no every time. I have to add, because it's only fair, one of my all-time favourite actors, Errol Flynn. He was charged with the statutory rape of 2 underage fans in 1942. He was acquitted. He had an amazing and clever technique. If he saw a girl that he liked, and I must admit I don't think he ever checked birth certificates, he would go up to the girl and say, "Oh, hey, you are so beautiful. I hope you realise I've named my boat after you. Would you like to come and see the boat?" What girl, seeing a movie star saying that to her, would say, "Oh no, can't I be bothered?" So they would all go, and when they got down to the boat wasn't named what they were named. It was called After You. My boat is called After You. The After You. He got away with it. The girls admitted that they wanted him to have sex with them, and he was quite happy to oblige. So he was acquitted. Some say that vast amounts of money from the film studio changed hands, though nobody can really prove nor disprove it. And the last one, Chuck Berry. I'm a big fan of Chuck Berry's too, but he's on the register, or he would be. In 1989, he used to own a restaurant, and the police discovered hidden cameras to videotape female customers using the toilets there. I can't think of anything less sexy than watching some woman, any woman, no matter how attractive they are, laying a pipe. No, don't think so. Having a wee? No, leave it alone. Some things are private for a reason. Now finally, on Alan Robson's Grisly Tales, I thought we would go somewhere, frankly, where we're all going. Soon as you're born, you are beginning to die. And I'm going to share with you some of the world's most terrifying, horrific, grisly, and really stressful funerals. I'm going to start with a wake held in a Ukrainian village called Zabalitoy. A man had died of drinking a black market bottle of booze. In the Ukraine, especially in the 70s and 80s, they used to make their own kind of hooch, and it was illegal, but pretty much everybody drank that kind of bootlegged booze. And this guy had died of being poisoned by it. He was in his coffin. He was buried. Straight after the burial, they went back to his house, where the same drink that had killed him was served to other people at the wake, and 10 more people died. Okay, let's have another. Let's drop a name. It's always good to drop a name. Keeps you interested. William the Conqueror. Now, he died back in 1087. His coffin, made of marble, was found to be too small for the king. So 2 soldiers were asked to stand on the king's body to squeeze it into the lump of marble. They did this, frankly, with a bit too much enthusiasm. They ended up having to jump up and down on it like you were packing a suitcase. And finally, they broke William the Conqueror's back. The broken spine ripped a hole in the king's stomach, causing it to explode with a huge bang. And of course, when it burst, the stench of internal anal gases overpowered everybody that was in the building. They quickly put the marble lid on that sucker. Okay, a famous, relatively famous, in Croatia anyway, is a man called Stanislav Kovac. He was knocked down and killed by a car while he was on a business trip in Germany. And we have to take our hat off to the Undertaker, who says, I know it's a long way away, but not to worry, he was going to take the journey over 570 miles to the man's funeral in Zagreb. He got there in the hearse, went round the back of the hearse, opened it, and realised that he'd forgot to put the man's body in it. Okay, let's drop another famous name. Joseph Stalin. A bit of a grisly torturer, mass murderer of his own people. He died in March 1953, and thousands of people were trampled to death, all battling to try and see his body lying in state, embalmed in Russia's famous state mausoleum. English King George IV. Now, when a royal personage dies, they're automatically embalmed. They all have been embalmed pretty much. But King George IV was badly embalmed, and his body became so swollen with gases that it almost burst through the lead lining of the coffin. What they ended up having to do was use a long drill to drill a hole through the lead of his coffin and through the king's body to release the putrid gases from within. After the gas literally farted out of the tube for almost 15 minutes, they filled the hole to keep the stench in the same way that a wife would make sure she keeps her head above the quilt at all times when sleeping with her husband. Back in the 20s, when George V's wife, whose name was Queen Mary, went to the funeral of her brother, who was called Adolphus, the procession, with horses, carriages, footmen, armed soldiers marching behind it. The funeral procession was interrupted by the sound of her brother's body exploding inside his coffin. Hard to believe that poshies wouldn't even get their own family buried properly, but such is the case. Alexander Douglas was the 10th Duke of Hamilton, and he outbid the British Museum when he bought an ancient tomb that had been built for an Egyptian princess. Douglas put it in his ancestral home. A fabulous mausoleum was built around it. Hamilton Palace is where it was. The whole idea was that he would use the mausoleum for his own funeral when he died. The thing is, he didn't die for years. It took him till 1852, and it was then his family discovered he was far too tall to fit inside it. But it cost so much, literally almost the cost of the palace itself. So his family, who loved him dearly, knew he wanted to be in there, so they sawed his feet off. Let's travel across the United States of America and go to Baton Rouge in the 1990s. A funeral service was carried out there for a 25-year-old who'd passed. And the whole service went into chaos when the dead body caught fire inside its coffin. Smoke began to pour out of the cracks around it, and they discovered that the embalming fluid had spontaneously combusted, or the body had spontaneously combusted. They can't prove it either way. Now, everything's bigger in Texas, so the Texicans would tell you. And there's a crematorium in San Antonio at the Meadow Lawn Memorial Park in Texas that was badly damaged by fire. It all happened when staff were cremating a body that weighed over 300 pounds. This was a massive human being. The owner of the crematorium told everybody that the regular crematorium fire ended up raging out of control because of all the fat in the huge man's body. It had caused the crematorium to hit an unusually high temperature that set fire to the entire building. Now, going to finish off with Frederick Armstrong. He was convicted of stabbing an 81-year-old preacher to death. Now, he didn't just leave it there, because this is Alan Robson's Grisly Tales, for heaven's sake. He stabbed him to death using a kitchen carving knife that he'd brought from his own home. He then slowly began decapitating the preacher in front of the entire congregation. In the congregation at the back were 3 police officers who quickly made their way past the people in their row and ran up just as the man began to hold up the head of the preacher in front of the petrified parishioners. His defense team declared that their client was obviously insane. It wasn't his fault. He was a mad and crazy individual. You can't send him to prison. He couldn't help doing what he did. And when the prosecution was saying that he should get the death penalty, the defense team said, surely no rational man would decapitate a preacher in the presence of police officers. The man's on death row now, waiting to get popped. And that is our grisly tale for this time. I hope you've enjoyed it. Stay well, stay safe, and if you can, squeeze the juice out of life as best you can. It seems to get harder day by day. However, we will be back, and I hope you'll spread the word. Maybe visit robsonsworld.com. It would help us out if you did. But until we are back together again, from me, Alan Robson, God bless you, and I wish you well.
you.